A vampire hunter wakes in a galaxy where the monsters have already won. The walls breathe corruption, the blood flows upward, and every shadow hides something that should not exist. He was built to kill the night, but here the night is eternal and worshipped as God. How do you hunt the darkness when darkness is all that remains? The pilgrim vessel, Sanctified Endurance, had drifted for 6 weeks through the outer reaches of the Carthax sector when the screaming finally stopped. This ancient cathedral freighter bore the scars of 3 millennia of service to the God Emperor. Its corridors, lined with devotional murals, now lay cracked and fading beneath layers of grime and incense residue. 17,000 souls had embarked from the forged shrine of Metallica Prime, bound for St. Sabbat's Reach, their holds packed with offerings, their hearts swollen with faith. Silence now filled those corridors, broken only by the rhythmic clank of failing life support systems and the wet sounds of feeding. In the lower decks, where dormitory blocks stretched for kilometers, something moved through the darkness with predatory grace. Emergency lighting had failed 3 days prior, leaving only the dim glow of prayer strips to reveal the carnage. Bodies sprawled across deck plating, faces locked in ecstatic horror, throats torn with surgical precision, the blood drained so completely the corpses seemed mummified. Walls bore sigils that hurt to behold, symbols writhing at perception's edge, whispering promises of eternal sensation, hunger satisfied and transcended. Blade opened his eyes to this nightmare. He lay on a steel pallet in a forsaken medic station, body racked with alien yet familiar pain. His last memory, a Prague warehouse, Frost's betrayal, an explosion that should have ended him. Gothic arches rose above, festooned with skulls and purity seals. Medical gear bore the 2-headed eagle's iconography, every surface etched with prayers in an unknown tongue he somehow understood, bypassing his mind, speaking to something deeper. He sat up, enhanced senses cataloging the abandoned space, blood-stained surgical tools, a flickering data slate with high Gothic readouts, air thick with copper, ozone, and sweet rot. His weapons were gone. Sword, firearms, tactical gear, replaced by a coarse gray robe marked with the Adeptus Mechanicus cogwheel. Thirst burned his throat, the vampire within stirring despite decades of discipline and Whistler's lost serum. Blade breathed deep, caging the beast through meditation. Feeding could wait. Answers came first. He slipped into the corridor, footsteps silent on metal, past walls pulsing with those writhing sigils, head throbbing under their gaze. Distant chanting echoed, rhythmic, obscene, twisting prayers into offerings of flesh and sensation. Corridors shifted unnaturally as he followed the sound, passing defaced chapels, saints' faces carved away, replaced with leering masks dripping crystallized blood, and crew quarters with ritual-arranged corpses. Sigils throbbed everywhere. The primary assembly hall loomed ahead, once a pilgrim cathedral, now an abattoir. Hundreds hung from ceiling chains, alive but delirious, blood dripping into chalices wielded by crimson-robed figures, humanoid yet wrong, movements too fluid, voices in impossible harmonies. At the ritual-fused altar stood the ritual's leader, once human, now transformed. Bruise-colored skin veined with inner glow, crimson eyes weeping blood, flayed skin wings as trophies, robes of shadow and suffering, a skull chalice in hand. It turned as Blade entered, eyes locking with predatory glee. Its voice a dying chorus. Another pilgrim comes to offer devotion. How delightful. The Prince of Pleasure will savor your essence, little lamb. Blade said nothing. He was already moving, his enhanced speed carrying him across the chamber in a blur of motion that surprised even the demon-touched thing on the altar. He struck with empty hands, driving his fist into the creature's chest with enough force to shatter ceramic armor. The impact sent shockwaves through the chamber, scattering the robed cultists and sending chalices clattering across the deck. The creature staggered back, surprise flickering across its inhuman features, but it did not fall. Instead, it laughed, like a sound of breaking glass and screaming infants.
"Oh, you are not a lamb at all. How wonderful. It has been so long since we had a proper warrior to drain." The cultists were converging now, their robes falling away to reveal forms warped by devotion to excess and sensation. Some had extra limbs grafted onto their torsos, others had replaced their faces with masks of living flesh taken from victims. They moved with unnatural coordination, flowing around Blade like water, their hands reaching for him with fingers ending in surgical blades and injection needles. He caught the first attacker by the wrist, twisted, and heard bones snap like kindling. The second he drove his elbow into, feeling ribs cave beneath the impact. The third managed to slash across his forearm with a blade that wept toxic venom, but the wound closed almost instantly, his vampire healing already knitting the damaged tissue back together. The daemon-touched lever watched with evident delight as Blade tore through its congregation. It made no move to intervene, content to observe as if this were performance art rather than combat. Only when the last cultist fell, their body broken and leaking blood across the altar steps, did the creature finally move. It flowed forward with liquid grace, making afterimages in the air, and struck at Blade with fingers that had become crystalline talons. The blow caught him across the chest, tearing through the rough robe and opening 4 parallel gashes in his flesh. This time, the wounds did not heal immediately. The edges burned with warp-touched corruption, the daemon's essence fighting against his regenerative abilities. Blade rolled away from the follow-up strike, his mind racing through combat calculations. This thing was not a vampire in any sense he understood. It was something older, more fundamental, a creature born from the psychic suffering of countless victims, but it still moved like a physical being. It still had mass and momentum. It could still be hurt. He came up near one of the hanging chains, grabbed it, and swung himself upward with enough force to tear the chain free from its mounting. The heavy links became a weapon in his hands, 20 feet of sanctified steel that he whipped through the air with brutal efficiency. The chain caught the daemon-touched cultist across the side of the head, the impact driving it to one knee. Black ichor sprayed from the wound, sizzling where it struck the deck. The daemon-touched creature's expression shifted from delight to rage, its features contorting into something even less human than before. "You dare strike a chosen of she who thirsts? You dare profane this sacred offering?"
It rose, and as it did, the very air around it began to distort. Reality itself seemed to bend toward the creature, drawn by the gravity of its existence. The hanging pilgrims began to convulse, their remaining life force pulled from their bodies in streams of glowing essence that flowed into the demon-touched thing like water down a drain. It grew as it fed, its form swelling with stolen vitality, its wings spreading until they scraped the chamber's vaulted ceiling. The temperature dropped precipitously, frost forming on every metal surface, and Blade's breath came out in clouds of vapor that crystallized and fell like snow. He knew he was outmatched. This thing had power beyond anything he had faced before, drawing on reserves of energy that seemed limitless. But Blade had not survived a lifetime of hunting vampires by fighting fair. He scanned the chamber with tactical precision, noting the placement of the support columns, the stress fractures in the ceiling where the chains had been mounted, the way the demon-touched creature had positioned itself directly beneath the largest structural weakness. He coiled his legs beneath him and leaped, not toward his enemy, but toward the nearest column. His hands found purchase on the Gothic scrollwork, and he climbed with inhuman speed, racing toward the ceiling as the creature below howled its fury. At the apex of the chamber, where the chains converged into a central mounting hub, Blade found what he was looking for. The hub was ancient, its metal corroded by centuries of moisture and neglect. The ritual below had weakened it further, the warp energies eating away at the sanctified iron like acid. He braced his feet against the ceiling and pulled, every enhanced muscle in his body straining against the metal's resistance. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a shriek of tortured steel, the hub tore free.
30 tons of chain, bone altar, and structural supports came crashing down. The demon-touched cultist barely had time to scream before it was buried beneath the avalanche of blessed metal. The impact shattered the deck plating, sending cracks radiating outward through multiple levels of the ship. The chamber itself groaned, its structural integrity compromised, and sections of the ceiling began to collapse inward. Blade dropped from his perch and landed in a crouch at the edge of the devastation, his ears ringing from the thunderous crash. He waited, watching for any sign of movement beneath the wreckage. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the pile began to shift. The creature emerged slowly, its form broken and bleeding black ichor from a dozen wounds. Half its face had been torn away, revealing the skull beneath. One wing hung useless, the membranes shredded. But it was still alive, still animate, driven by a hunger that transcended physical damage. It crawled toward Blade, dragging its ruined body across the deck, leaving a trail of corruption in its wake. "You cannot kill what has already died 1,000 deaths, little hunter. You cannot end what she has claimed for eternity. We are legion. We are hunger unending. And you will feed us for a very long time." Blade watched it approach, his expression unreadable. Then he moved, crossing the distance between them in a single stride. He knelt beside the broken thing and placed one hand on its malformed skull, his fingers pressing into the soft tissue where its temple should have been. He could feel the warp energy churning beneath the surface, could sense the demon that rode within the human host like a parasite. His vampire nature recoiled from it, recognizing a predator that fed on different prey but operated from the same fundamental hunger. "I've been killing things that won't die for a long time. You are not special." He squeezed, and the skull collapsed inward with a wet crunch. The demon-touched cultist spasmed once, twice, then went still. The light faded from his eyes, and the warp energies that animated it dissipated into the void, leaving behind only a broken corpse that looked almost pitiful in its ruin. Blade stood and stepped away, his gaze moving to the pilgrims still hanging from what remained of the chains. Most were dead now, their life force drained beyond recovery, but some still breathed, their chests rising and falling in shallow gasps. He began the work of lowering them down one by one. Knowing that each moment he spent here put him at risk of discovery by whatever authorities governed this nightmare place, he had freed perhaps a dozen survivors when the alarms began to wail. The sound was deafening, a klaxon that echoed through every corridor of the ship, accompanied by a recorded voice speaking in that same language he did not know but could somehow understand. The words spoke of contamination and quarantine, of purging protocols and holy fire. Blade looked up at the ceiling, at the damage he had caused, and realized his mistake. The structural collapse had triggered the ship's automated defense systems. Somewhere in the ship's command deck, servitors were even now routing power to weapons batteries designed to sterilize entire sections of compromised hull. He had minutes at best before this chamber became a crematorium. He grabbed the nearest conscious pilgrim, a young woman whose eyes had gone glassy with shock, and slung her over his shoulder. Then he ran, moving through the collapsing architecture with the survivors he could carry, following his instincts towards what felt like safety. Behind him, the assembly hall erupted in flames as the purge protocols activated, incinerating everything that remained. The heat pursued him through the corridors, a wave of cleansing fire that consumed corruption and innocence alike with equal fervor. He burst through a pressure door just as it began to seal, rolling into a connecting passage that led towards the ship's dorsal spine. The survivors he had saved lay gasping on the deck, their bodies too weak to do more than breathe. He knelt beside them, checking pulses and assessing injuries with practiced efficiency. They would live, though they would bear the scars of this horror for the rest of their days. The young woman he had carried opened her eyes and looked at him with an expression caught between terror and gratitude. "What are you?" she whispered in Gothic that his mind translated automatically. "Are you an angel sent by the Emperor?"
Blade considered the question. In the world he had left behind, he was many things: hunter, weapon, daywalker, but never an angel. He did not know what he was in this place, in this nightmare galaxy where demons were real and fed on the souls of the faithful. He knew only that the thirst was growing stronger, that his body was burning through its reserves at an unsustainable rate, and that he would need to feed soon or lose control entirely. "No," he said finally, "I'm not an angel." The alarms cut off abruptly, replaced by a new sound that made every hair on Blade's neck stand on end. It was the deep, resonant tone of a ship's teleportarium engaging, the reality-bending thunder of matter translocation. He rose to his feet, his body tensing for combat as the air in the corridor began to shimmer and distort. Figures materialized from the shimmering field, their forms resolving from light into solid matter with a sound like reality tearing. They stood 7 feet tall in armor of deepest black, their pauldrons bearing the silver symbol of a stylized eye surrounded by skull imagery. Their weapons were aimed at Blade before they had fully materialized, and targeting lasers painted his chest with a dozen crimson dots. Deathwatch. Space Marines of the Imperial Inquisition, warriors drawn from multiple chapters and bound together in service to humanity's defense against the Xenos and the Demon. Each one was a veteran of countless battles, their armor bearing the honors and scars of decades of service. They moved with the cold efficiency of killers who had perfected their craft across the stars, their bolters held steady despite the awkward positioning of the teleport insertion. The leader stepped forward, his helmet's eye lenses glowing with cold blue light, and when he spoke, his voice came through vox grills that stripped away all humanity and left only authority. "Unidentified entity, by the authority of the Holy Ordos, you are commanded to submit to imperial judgment. Drop to your knees and place your hands behind your head. Any resistance will be met with immediate lethal force." Blade looked at the Space Marines, at the weapons trained on him, at the pilgrims huddled behind him who would be caught in the crossfire if this turned violent. He calculated angles and trajectories, measured the distance between himself and the nearest cover, estimated his chances of survival if he tried to fight his way out. The numbers were not good. These were not the vampires and ghouls he was accustomed to hunting. These were soldiers trained and equipped to fight enemies that could tear apart tanks with their bare hands. Even with his enhanced abilities, even with his vampire strength and speed, he would be hard-pressed to survive an engagement with a full Deathwatch kill team. But he had not survived this long by making the smart choice. He had survived by refusing to surrender, by fighting even when the odds were impossible, by being too stubborn to die when death would have been easier. His body shifted into combat stance, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. The Space Marines tensed in response, their fingers tightening on triggers, their targeting systems locking onto vital areas. The standoff lasted 3 heartbeats. Then a new voice cut through the tension, transmitted through the kill team's Vox network, but audible to Blade's enhanced hearing. "Hold fire. I want him alive." The Space Marines did not lower their weapons, but neither did they open fire. Instead, they held their positions, statues in black ceramite, as a new figure emerged from the shadows of the corridor. She was human, or appeared to be, dressed in armor that was functional but less bulky than the Astartes warplate. Her face was severe, all sharp angles and cold eyes, and she carried herself with the absolute authority of someone who had commanded the deaths of thousands and slept soundly afterwards. At her hip hung a plasma pistol whose casing bore the seal of the Ordo Malleus, and in the other hand she held a data slate that displayed information Blade could not read from this distance. Inquisitor Vesta R'Lan studied him with clinical interest, her gaze moving from his face to his hands to the survivors cowering behind him. She spoke in her measured and calm tone, the tone of someone conducting an experiment rather than an interrogation. "You are not human, or rather you were human once, but been altered by forces I do not yet understand.
My Augpex reading showed genetic markers consistent with warp mutation, but your psychic signature is almost non-existent. The survivors report that you saved them from the cultists, yet you move and fight with capabilities that suggest demonic enhancement. You are an anomaly, and I do not tolerate anomalies in my sector." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "You will come with me. You will submit to examination and interrogation, and you will tell me everything about who created you and what your purpose is. If you cooperate, your death will be quick. If you resist, I will have my kill team dismantle you piece by piece until we extract the truth from your screaming remains." Blade met her gaze without flinching. He had dealt with authority figures before, with government agents and military commanders who saw him as a weapon to be controlled or a threat to be eliminated. This woman was no different, just another bureaucrat convinced that she alone understood the nature of evil and how to fight it. But there was something in her eyes, a hardness born from experiences that had stripped away any illusions about the universe and left only pragmatic brutality. She meant every word of her threat, and she had the power to carry it out. "No," he said carefully, his voice carrying clearly despite the damaged state of the corridor. "I'm not your enemy. Whatever you think I am, whatever your senses are telling you, I'm not one of those things that attacked this ship. I hunt them. It's what I do." The Inquisitor's expression did not change. She consulted her data slate again, scrolling through information that passed too quickly for Blade to track. After a moment, she looked back at him. "My records showed that this vessel departed Metallica Prime with full crew and passenger complements 6 weeks ago. Within the first week of warp travel, incidents began occurring. Crew members disappeared. Pilgrims reported strange dreams and compulsions. The astropathic choir fell silent. By week 3, contact with the ship was lost entirely. We intercepted its distress beacon 4 days ago and dispatched my team to investigate." She gestured to the corridor around them, to the signs of slaughter and corruption. "We expected to find the ship completely lost to chaos. Instead, we find you, an unknown mutant standing among the corpses of heretics you apparently killed single-handedly. That is not the behavior of a victim. That is the behavior of an infiltrator, or a weapon deployed by the ruinous powers to eliminate competition." Blade felt the thirst burning stronger in his throat. He had expended enormous energy in the fight below, and his body was demanding payment. The scent of blood from the wounded pilgrims behind him was overwhelming, calling to the vampire within with promises of relief and power. He forced it down, maintained his control, but knew it was only a matter of time before his nature betrayed him to these hunters.
Test me if you want. Scan me, do whatever you need to verify what I'm telling you. But those people behind me need medical attention, and there might be more survivors elsewhere on the ship. Are you going to help them, or are we going to stand here while they bleed out?" It was a calculated gamble, appealing to whatever sense of duty this Inquisitor possessed beneath her cold exterior. For a long moment she remained silent, weighing his words against her suspicions. Then she made a gesture with her free hand, and 2 of the Space Marines lowered their bolters and moved to assist the wounded pilgrims. The others maintained their aim on Blade, ready to cut him down at the first sign of hostility. "You will proceed ahead of us to the ship's command deck," the Inquisitor ordered. "Any deviation from the prescribed route will be considered an escape attempt and dealt with accordingly. When we reach the deck, you will interface with the ship's cogitator banks and provide a full accounting of everything you remember since awakening aboard this vessel. If your story proves truthful and useful, I may reconsider the nature of your execution. If it does not, well, we have ways of extracting information from even the most resistant subjects." She gestured, and the kill team formed up around Blade in a tactical formation that would allow them to fire from multiple angles simultaneously. He was given no choice but to walk in the direction they indicated, moving through corridors that grew more damaged as they climbed toward the command sections. The ship groaned around them, its wounded structure protesting every movement. They passed through sections where the walls had melted from warp fire, where reality itself had grown thin and allowed glimpses of the immaterium bleeding through. Blade saw things in those gaps that made his mind recoil, geometries that could not exist in sane space, colors that had no names and hurt to perceive. He forced himself to look away, to focus on the path ahead, but the images lingered at the edges of his vision, like after-images burned into his retinas. The command deck, when they finally reached it, was a charnel house. The bridge crew lay dead at their stations, their bodies arranged in ritualistic patterns that suggested they had killed each other in an orgy of violence. The captain sat in his command throne with his throat slit from ear to ear, his hands still clutching the armrests in a death grip. The cogitator banks sparked and flickered with corrupted data, their screens displaying nonsense strings interspersed with heretical symbology. And standing at the primary navigation console, hunched over the controls like a vulture over carrion, was another of the demon-touched cultists. This one was different from the leader Blade had killed below. It was smaller, more human in appearance, dressed in the tattered remains of what had once been an officer's uniform. Its skin was pale to the point of translucency, and its eyes glowed with the same crimson light as its dead master. When it turned to face the new arrivals, its lips pulled back to reveal teeth that had been filed to points and capped with silver. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping from a ruptured pipe, and its hands moved across the console in patterns that were simultaneously random and purposeful. The seeds are planted, the infection spreads, the prince laughs at your futile resistance. The cultist's voice was wrong, layered with harmonics that suggested multiple speakers talking in perfect synchronization. This vessel is just the beginning. Every world it was meant to visit, every population center it would have touched, all will know the gift of sensation perfected. You cannot stop what has already been set in motion. The Inquisitor raised her plasma pistol without hesitation and fired. The superheated bolt of matter caught the cultist's center mass, vaporizing its torso in a flash of blinding light and searing heat. The body collapsed, its severed legs twitching as the warp energy animating them dissipated. But even as it died, the cultist laughed, a sound that echoed through the command deck and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Too late, always too late. She feasts, and you are all invited to the table. The corpse crumbled to ash, leaving behind only the scorch mark on the deck and the lingering smell of burnt ozone. The Inquisitor approached the navigation console, her expression grim as she studied the readouts. Whatever she saw there made her features tighten into something approaching genuine concern. She tapped commands into the console with practiced efficiency, pulling up navigational charts and projected course data. After several minutes of intense scrutiny, she stepped back and turned to address her kill team. The ship's planned route would have taken it through 7 major population centers, including the hive cities of Carthax Prime and the shrine worlds of the Sabbath Cluster. If this vessel had been allowed to dock at any of those locations, the cult's infection would have spread to billions of souls. She paused, letting the magnitude of that near catastrophe sink in. We missed this by hours. If not for the structural damage triggering the automated distress beacon early, this ship would have completed its warp transit undetected and delivered its payload directly into the heart of the sector's pilgrimage network. One of the Space Marines, his armor bearing the heraldry of the Blood Angels chapter, spoke in a voice that rumbled with barely contained fury. Then we cleanse this vessel utterly. Nothing survives. We reduce it to atoms and scatter those atoms across the void where they can never contaminate the faithful. The Inquisitor shook her head. Not yet. We need to trace the source of the infection.
Someone or something corrupted this ship during its warp transit, which means there is a breach in the sector's Jellifield network. We need intelligence before we can act decisively, which is where you become useful. You fought these cultists. You survived direct contact with their corruption. Either you possess natural resistance to the warp, or you have been exposed to this specific strain before. Either way, you are going to help me find out where they came from and how to stop them from spreading further. Blade considered refusing. He owed these people nothing, owed this Imperium nothing. But he also understood that he was trapped on this ship in the middle of a void he could not navigate, hunted by forces he barely comprehended. If he wanted to survive long enough to find answers, to understand what brought him to this nightmare place and whether there was any way back to his own world, he would need allies, even temporary ones, even ones who saw him as a weapon rather than a person.
"Fine," he said. "But I need something first. Food, water, medical supplies." He paused, calculating how much truth to reveal. "My abilities come with a cost. If I don't pay that cost soon, I'm going to become more dangerous than whatever's left of this cult." The Inquisitor studied him with renewed interest. "You require sustenance. Specifically, you require blood. I saw the way you looked at the wounded pilgrims, the way your body tensed when their injuries bled freely. You are a hemivore of some description, though not any strain my Medicae training recognizes." She tapped her data slate, making notations. "Very well. My ship has medical facilities that can synthesize blood plasma. You will be given rations sufficient to maintain your combat effectiveness, but not enough to pose a threat to my crew. And you will submit to biological sampling so that my tech priests can analyze your physiology. Those are my terms. Accept them, or I leave you here when we detonate this wreck." It was not a negotiation. It was an ultimatum delivered with the casual certainty of someone who held all the power. Blade had heard similar speeches before from government handlers and SHID operatives who thought they could control him through leverage and threat. Most of them were dead now, victims of their own arrogance and the chaos that followed wherever vampires walked. But this woman was different. She had the resources and the ruthlessness to make good on her promises, and he was in no position to fight an entire inquisitorial vessel. "Deal," he said simply. The kill team escorted him from the command deck, their bolters never wavering from their aim points. They moved through corridors that had become alien landscapes, where the ship's systems were failing in cascades of sparks and venting atmosphere. Emergency bulkheads sealed behind them as they passed, the automated systems trying desperately to contain the spreading damage. They reached a teleportarium chamber on the dorsal spine, a room filled with arcane machinery that hummed with barely contained power. The Space Marines took up positions on marked platforms, their armor interfaces linking with the teleporter systems, and Blade was directed to stand at the center of the array. The Inquisitor stood beside him, her plasma pistol holstered, but her hand resting on its grip in an unsubtle threat. "My ship is the Sword of Righteous Censure, an Imperial Navy frigate retrofitted for inquisitorial operations. You will address me as Inquisitor Raylon or simply Inquisitor. You will obey all commands without question. You will not speak to any crew member without permission, and you will remember that your continued existence is contingent on your usefulness to my investigation. Are these terms clear?" "Crystal," Blade said. The teleporter activated with a sound like reality screaming. The world dissolved into light and impossible geometries. Blade's consciousness fragmented across dimensions as his physical form was torn apart and reassembled elsewhere. For a subjective eternity, he existed as pure information, aware of himself, but lacking any frame of reference or sensory input. Then, with a thunderclap of displaced air, he was solid again, standing on a different teleportarium platform aboard a different ship. The transition left him disoriented, his enhanced senses struggling to recalibrate, his vampire nature howling in confusion at the violation of natural law he had just experienced. The Sword of Righteous Censure was a warship in the truest sense,
Every surface was armored, every corridor had firing positions, every chamber was designed to be defensible in case of boarding actions. The crew moved with military precision, their uniforms clean and their weapons well maintained. They gave Blade a wide berth as the kill team marched him through the ship, their expressions a mixture of fear and disgust. They could hear their whispered prayers, their invocations of the Emperor's protection against the abomination that walked among them. It reminded him of how civilians had looked at him in his own world before he had learned to move unseen through their society. The Medicae Bay was a stark chamber filled with equipment that looked more like torture implements than healing tools. Servitors, their human bodies augmented with mechanical components and lobotized into unquestioning obedience, stood at various stations, awaiting commands from their tech priest overseers. The Inquisitor directed Blade to a medical slab in the center of the room, and he complied without resistance. Restraints snapped into place around his wrists and ankles, mag-locked bands that would held a normal human immobile. They would slow him down if he tried to escape, but would not stop him. The Inquisitor knew this, judging by the way she positioned her kill team at every angle with clear fields of fire. A tech priest approached, its face hidden by a bronze mask, its body more machine than flesh. It carried instruments that clicked and whirred as it moved, sensor arrays that swept across Blade's body in patterns of red light. The tech priest's binary cant was incomprehensible to Blade, but he could see the data streaming across nearby screens, biological information being cataloged and analyzed. After several minutes of examination, the tech priest turned to the Inquisitor and delivered its report in Gothic. Subject displays genetic markers consistent with human baseline, but with extensive augmentation of unknown origin. Musculature exhibits density approximately 3.7 times that of standard human norms. Skeletal structure shows reinforcement suggestive of ceramic composite layering, though analysis indicates organic rather than mechanical enhancement. Cardiovascular system operates at efficiency levels that should result in rapid burnout, yet tissue samples show no sign of degradation. Most significantly, subject's blood contains viral components that defy conventional classification. The Inquisitor leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. Viral components. Elaborate.
The tech priest gestured, and a hololithic display materialized above the medical slab. It showed Blade's blood at microscopic magnification, the cells moving in currents that were both beautiful and alien. Among the normal red and white cells swam others, darker and more aggressive, that seemed to consume and convert their neighbors in an endless cycle of predation and reproduction. The viral agents operate as both parasite and symbiote. They enhance host capabilities while requiring constant feeding on specific biological compounds to maintain stability. Without regular intake of hemoglobin and associated proteins, the viral load becomes increasingly aggressive, eventually overwhelming host neural functions and transforming the subject into a mindless predator. In essence, the subject is sustained by controlled infection with what can only be described as weaponized vampirism. The kill team shifted, their weapons coming up fractionally. The very word vampire carried weight in Imperial culture, associated with xenos like the hemovores of the Eastern Fringe and demonic entities that fed on life essence. To name Blade as such was to mark him as a threat requiring immediate termination. But the Inquisitor raised a hand, stalling their reaction. Stand down. If he were completely lost to the infection, he would not have saved the pilgrims. He would have fed on them. She turned her gaze back to Blade. But the tech priest is correct about the risk. How long since you last fed? Blade had been counting the hours since his awakening, measuring his degradation against past experience. 72 hours, maybe more. I can go a week without feeding if I'm not expending energy. But after what happened on that ship, I'm burning through my reserves fast. Another day, maybe 2, before I start losing control. The Inquisitor nodded slowly, making calculations behind her eyes. Then she turned to one of the servitors. Prepare 6 liters of synthetic blood plasma, standard AB negative formulation. Deliver it in sealed containers.
She looked back at Blade. "You will feed under controlled conditions. Any attempt to attack crew members will result in immediate termination. Understood?" "Understood." The synthetic blood, when it arrived, was cold and tasted of chemicals and preservation agents. It was nothing like the rich, coppery warmth of fresh blood, but it was enough. Blade drank slowly, forcing himself to maintain control even as his vampire nature howled for more. The thirst receded gradually, like a tide pulling back from a shore, leaving him clear-headed and focused. He could feel his body processing the nutrients, using the hemoglobin to repair damage and restore depleted reserves. It was not satisfaction, but it was survival. When he finished, the Inquisitor dismissed the tech priests and servitors, leaving only her kill team as witnesses to what came next. She pulled up a chair and sat across from Blade, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp with intelligence. "Now we talk. You are going to tell me everything, and I will decide if any of it is true. Start with your name." "Blade. That is a designation, not a name, but it will suffice." She consulted her data slate. "Tell me about your origins. Where were you born? Who created you? What is your purpose?" Blade considered how much to reveal. These people understood genetic engineering and biological weapons. They accepted the existence of demons and warp corruption as observable facts. But would they understand a world without their emperor, without their imperium? Would they believe him if he told him he came from Earth? A planet clearly existed in this universe, but might be so far removed from their experience as mythical. He decided on a version of the truth that would make sense to them. "I was born human. I was infected with the vampire virus as a child, during my mother's pregnancy. Instead of turning me into a mindless monster, the infection merged with my developing biology and created something different, a hybrid. I retained my humanity and my will, but gained the physical capabilities of the things that hunt your people in the dark. I've spent my life hunting others like me, creatures that prey on the innocent and hide among normal society." The Inquisitor listened without interruption, her expression neutral. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, processing what she had heard against her own knowledge and experience. Finally, she spoke. "Your story has elements of truth. Viral vampirism is known to the Imperium, though it typically manifests in xenospecies rather than human populations. The concept of a hybrid hunter, someone who uses the enemy's own weapons against them, is not unprecedented. We have our own Inquisitors who undergo controlled infection with gene-stealer material to better hunt those Xenos abominations." She paused. "But your story also raises questions. If you were created through natural means, why have we never encountered others like you? If your condition is the result of pregnancy transmission, there should be more hybrids scattered across the galaxy. Yet our records show nothing matching your profile. Maybe I'm the first one, or maybe I'm the only one who survived. Most people infected with the vampire virus don't keep their humanity. They turn into monsters within days or weeks. I'm the exception. And that makes you valuable, but also dangerous. You are a weapon without a master, a predator without a pack. In my experience, such creatures inevitably turn on those around them." She leaned forward slightly. "However, you are also a tool I can use. The cult that infected the sanctified endurance is part of a larger network. We have been tracking similar outbreaks across the sector for the past 6 months. Pilgrim ships corrupted during warp transit, isolated colonies falling to blood cults that worship Slanesh through the vehicle of ritual exsanguination. And at the center of it all, a figure our agents have been unable to identify or locate, someone or something coordinating these attacks with purpose and intelligence." Blade felt a familiar cold settling into his gut. He knew this pattern. It was the same pattern he had seen countless times in his own world, the signature of a vampire trying to build a network of thralls and servants to increase their power base. This cult was no different, just operating at a scale that would have been impossible back home.
"You want me to hunt them?" he said. Not a question, a statement of fact. "I want you to help me destroy them," the Inquisitor corrected. You have capabilities my Death Watch lacks. You can move among corrupted populations without triggering their alarms. You can identify infected individuals through methods my Auspex cannot replicate. And most importantly, you are expendable. If you die in the pursuit of this enemy, the Imperium loses nothing. If you succeed, we gain valuable intelligence and eliminate a major threat to sector stability. It was brutally honest in a way that Blade almost respected. No pretense of partnership or shared cause, just a clear acknowledgement that he was a weapon to be pointed at the enemy and discarded when no longer useful. He had worked under similar terms before with organizations that saw him as a necessary evil rather than an ally. At least this Inquisitor was not trying to pretend otherwise. "What's the target?" he asked. The Inquisitor activated her data slate, and a hololithic projection appeared in the space between them. It showed a massive structure, a hive city that sprawled across the surface of a planet like a cancer, its towers reaching into a polluted sky and its roots delving deep into the planetary crust. The scale was staggering, suggesting a population in the billions, packed into vertical slums and industrial zones. Hive Cephalus, primary population center of the planet Valdris Tertus. 3 weeks ago, the local arbitrators reported an increase in disappearances among the lower hive populations. 2 weeks ago, an entire district went silent, its inhabitants vanishing overnight. 1 week ago, our astropathic communications with the planetary governor were disrupted by psychic interference suggestive of warp incursion. As of 2 days ago, the hive has gone completely dark. No Vox traffic, no orbital traffic, no response to any attempts at contact. She zoomed the projection in, showing the hive's lower levels, where the architecture became a twisted maze of ancient construction and jury-rigged infrastructure. Our analysis suggests the cult has established a stronghold somewhere in the Underhive, the oldest and most lawless sections of the city. They are using the local population as raw material for some larger ritual, draining them of blood and life essence to feed whatever demonic entity they serve. If we do not intervene soon, the entire hive will be lost, 7 billion souls consumed by the ruinous powers. Blade studied the projection, his mind automatically breaking down the tactical situation. A hive city was the worst possible environment for this kind of fight. Too many people, too many hiding places, too many potential vectors for the cult to spread its infection. It would be like trying to sterilize a wound that covered an entire body. You could burn away the visible corruption, but the infection would be festering in the blood and bone, ready to resurge the moment your attention wavered. "You're going to need more than me in your kill team," he said. "A city that size, you need an army. Thousands of soldiers sweeping level by level, clearing and holding territory as they advance." "I have requisitioned a full regiment of Imperial Guard, 3,000 troops with armored support and artillery. They are currently en route from the neighboring system and will arrive within the week, but I cannot wait for them. Every day we delay is another day the cult grows stronger and consumes more victims. I need advanced reconnaissance. I need someone who can infiltrate the Underhive, locate the cult's central operations, and provide targeting data for a precision strike." She met his gaze. "That someone is you." Blade looked at the hololithic image of the hive, at the countless levels and districts that would be each a nightmare to navigate. He thought about the creatures he had fought on the pilgrim vessel, about their speed and their hunger and the warp-touched power that animated them. He thought about facing potentially thousands of them in the dark, without backup, without extraction options. It was suicide, a one-way trip into hell with only the vague promise of inquisitorial support when and if he managed to complete the mission. "When do we leave?" he asked. The Inquisitor allowed herself a small, cold smile. "Within an hour. My ship is already en route to Valdris Tertus. We will insert you via drop pod to avoid alerting the cult to our presence. You will have a Vox bead for communication and a locator beacon for extraction. Beyond that, you operate alone. Hunt the cult, find their leaders, kill what you can and report what you cannot, and try not to get yourself killed before you provide me with something useful."
She stood, signaling the end of the briefing. The kill team moved to escort Blade from the Medicae bay, but the Inquisitor raised a hand to stop them. She stepped close to Blade, close enough that he could see the scars on her face, old wounds that told stories of battles survived and enemies defeated. "One more thing," she said quietly. "I am not your friend. I am not your ally. I am the instrument of the Imperium's will, and I will sacrifice you without hesitation if it serves the greater good of the Imperium. But I am also not your enemy, provided you remain useful. Keep that in mind as you descend into the Underhive. Your survival depends on your value to me." Blade held her gaze. "Same to you, Inquisitor. Because when this is over, when your cult is destroyed and your sector is safe, I'm going to find a way back to my world, and I won't let you or anyone else stand in my way." The Inquisitor's smile widened fractionally. "Good. A weapon that wants to survive fights harder than one resigned to death. I will hold you to that promise, Hunter." She turned and walked away, her boots echoing on the Medicae bay's deck plating. Altitude indicators, velocity readouts, impact countdowns. The pod's door began to close, sealing him inside the armored shell. Through the narrowing gap, he saw the Inquisitor standing at the observation gallery, watching the deployment with cold interest. Their eyes met for a moment, and he saw in her gaze the same calculation he had seen in countless handlers before. He was a tool, a weapon, useful until proven otherwise, then discarded with no sentiment or regret.
The door sealed shut with a hiss of pressurizing atmosphere. The pod's interior lights dimmed to red, and then the launch rails engaged, magnetic accelerators hurling the pod down the deployment tube toward the void beyond the ship's hull. Blade felt the acceleration crushing him into the couch, felt his enhanced physiology straining to maintain consciousness against the G-forces. The pod burst from the sword of righteous censure and plunged toward the planet below, its hull beginning to glow with atmospheric friction. Valdris Tertius swelled in the viewport, a world of gray and brown, its surface scarred by millennia of industrial exploitation. Hive Cephalus rose from the planet's northern continent like a malignant tumor, its towers stabbing upward through layers of pollution. The pod's retrothrusters fired, slowing its descent, and then it was falling through the Hive's airspace, plummeting past residential districts and industrial zones, toward the Underhive far below. The impact, when it came, was brutal. The pod struck the Underhive's surface at a speed that would have killed a normal human, despite the crash webbing and dampening systems. Blade felt ribs crack from the deceleration, felt blood fill his lungs, but his vampire healing was already at work, knitting bone and tissue back together even as the pod's door blew outward in a shower of explosive bolts. He tore free of the harness and stumbled out into the Underhive's perpetual darkness. The air was thick with chemical pollutants and the stench of decay. Water dripped from rusted pipes overhead, forming pools of toxic sludge on the corroded deck plating. The only light came from flickering lumen strips powered by failing generators, casting everything in shades of sickly green and amber. In the distance he could hear the sounds of the Hive's lower levels, the grinding of machinery and the howling of things that should not exist in any sane world. Blade checked his gear, verified the Voxbead's connection, and oriented himself using the tactical data the pod had downloaded to his neural memory during descent. The cult's suspected stronghold was 3 kilometers deeper into the Underhive, in a section marked on Imperial records as the Rust Quarter, an abandoned industrial zone that had been sealed off decades ago after contamination incidents killed thousands of workers. If the Inquisitor's intelligence was accurate, that was where he would find his answers. He started walking, his enhanced senses probing the darkness ahead for threats. Behind him, the drop pod's self-destruct charges detonated, erasing any evidence of his insertion. The sound echoed through the Underhive's canyons of steel and stone, and Blade knew that every predator in the area would now be converging on his position to investigate. Let them come, he thought. He had not come here to hide. He had come to hunt. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, the cult was waiting.
The underhive of Sepphoris was a place where the laws of the upper levels held no sway, where gangs and mutants and things far worse than either carved out territories in the ruins of older civilizations. Blade moved through this nightmare landscape with the fluid grace of a predator, his body instinctively adjusting to the uneven terrain and the ever-present threat of ambush. The deeper he descended, following the path his tactical data suggested, the more signs of corruption he encountered. Corpses hung from chains, their blood drained and their flesh marked with symbols that hurt to look upon. Shrines to the Dark Prince stood at intersections, crude constructions of bone and salvaged metal, where offerings of blood and sensation were left by those desperate or mad enough to seek the daemon's favor. Everywhere, scratched into walls or painted in substances that might have been blood or might have been something worse, were messages warning intruders away from the territories claimed by the cult. Blade ignored the warnings. He had tracked vampires through their lairs before, through sewers and abandoned buildings where they thought themselves safe from the sun and from justice. This was no different, just larger in scale and more openly hostile. He moved from shadow to shadow, avoiding the few inhabitants who still clung to life in these depths. They were pitiful creatures, mutants and outcasts who had been driven from the upper levels and now eked out existence in the ruins of older civilizations. Blade moved through this nightmare landscape with the fluid grace of a predator, his body instinctively adjusting to the uneven terrain and the ever-present threat of ambush. The deeper he descended, following the path his tactical data suggested, the more signs of corruption he encountered. Corpses hung from chains, their blood drained and their flesh marked with symbols that hurt to look upon. Shrines to the Dark Prince stood at intersections, crude constructions of bone and salvaged metal, where offerings of blood and sensation were left by those desperate or mad enough to seek the daemon's favor. Everywhere, scratched into walls or painted in substances that might have been blood or might have been something worse, were messages warning intruders away from the territories claimed by the cult. Blade ignored the warnings. He had tracked vampires through their lairs before, through sewers and abandoned buildings where they thought themselves safe from the sun and from justice. This was no different, just larger in scale and more openly hostile. He moved from shadow to shadow, avoiding the few inhabitants who still clung to life in these depths. They were pitiful creatures, mutants and outcasts who had been driven from the upper levels and now eked out existence in the ruins of older civilizations. Blade moved through this nightmare landscape with the fluid grace of a predator, his body instinctively adjusting to the uneven terrain and the ever-present threat of ambush. The deeper he descended, following the path his tactical data suggested, the more signs of corruption he encountered. Corpses hung from chains, their blood drained and their flesh marked with symbols that hurt to look upon. Shrines to the Dark Prince stood at intersections, crude constructions of bone and salvaged metal, where offerings of blood and sensation were left by those desperate or mad enough to seek the daemon's favor. Everywhere, scratched into walls or painted in substances that might have been blood or might have been something worse, were messages warning intruders away from the territories claimed by the cult. Blade ignored the warnings. He had tracked vampires through their lairs before, through sewers and abandoned buildings where they thought themselves safe from the sun and from justice. This was no different, just larger in scale and more openly hostile. He moved from shadow to shadow, avoiding the few inhabitants who still clung to life in these depths. They were pitiful creatures, mutants and outcasts who had been driven from the upper levels and now eked out existence in the ruins of older civilizations. Blade moved through this nightmare landscape with the fluid grace of a predator, his body instinctively adjusting to the uneven terrain and the ever-present threat of ambush. The deeper he descended, following the path his tactical data suggested, the more signs of corruption he encountered. Corpses hung from chains, their blood drained and their flesh marked with symbols that hurt to look upon. Shrines to the Dark Prince stood at intersections, crude constructions of bone and salvaged metal, where offerings of blood and sensation were left by those desperate or mad enough to seek the daemon's favor. Everywhere, scratched into walls or painted in substances that might have been blood or might have been something worse, were messages warning intruders away from the territories claimed by the cult. Blade ignored the warnings. He had tracked vampires through their lairs before, through sewers and abandoned buildings where they thought themselves safe from the sun and from justice. This was no different, just larger in scale and more openly hostile. He moved from shadow to shadow, avoiding the few inhabitants who still clung to life in these depths. They were pitiful creatures, mutants and outcasts who had been driven from the upper levels and now eked out existence in the ruins of older civilizations. Blade moved through this nightmare landscape with the fluid grace of a predator, his body instinctively adjusting to the uneven terrain and the ever-present threat of ambush. The deeper he descended, following the path his tactical data suggested, the more signs of corruption he encountered. Corpses hung from chains, their blood drained and their flesh marked with symbols that hurt to look upon. Shrines to the Dark Prince stood at intersections, crude constructions of bone and salvaged metal, where offerings of blood and sensation were left by those desperate or mad enough to seek the daemon's favor. Everywhere, scratched into walls or painted in substances that might have been blood or might have been something worse, were messages warning intruders away from the territories claimed by the cult. Blade ignored the warnings. He had tracked vampires through their lairs before, through sewers and abandoned buildings where they thought themselves safe from the sun and from justice. This was no different, just larger in scale and more openly hostile. He moved from shadow to shadow, avoiding the few inhabitants who still clung to life in these depths. They were pitiful creatures, mutants and outcasts who had been driven from the upper levels and now eked out existence in the ruins of older civilizations. Blade moved through this nightmare landscape with the fluid grace of a predator, his body instinctively adjusting to the uneven terrain and the ever-present threat of ambush. The deeper he descended, following the path his tactical data suggested, the more signs of corruption he encountered. Corpses hung from chains, their blood drained and their flesh marked with symbols that hurt to look upon. Shrines to the Dark Prince stood at intersections, crude constructions of bone and salvaged metal, where offerings of blood and sensation were left by those desperate or mad enough to seek the daemon's favor. Everywhere, scratched into walls or painted in substances that might have been blood or might have been something worse, were messages warning intruders away from the territories claimed by the cult. Blade ignored the warnings. He had tracked vampires through their lairs before, through sewers and abandoned buildings where they thought themselves safe from the sun and from justice. This was no different, just larger in scale and more openly hostile. He moved from shadow to shadow, avoiding the few inhabitants who still clung to life in these depths. They were pitiful creatures, mutants and outcasts who had been driven from the upper levels and now eked out existence in the ruins. They watched him pass with eyes that glowed in the darkness, but none challenged him. Perhaps they sensed what he was, recognized a fellow predator, and decided discretion was wiser than confrontation. He had been walking for an hour when he encountered the first patrol. They came out of the darkness ahead, 6 figures in robes that had once been red but were now stained black with dried blood. They moved with the same unnatural coordination he had seen in the cultists on the sanctified endurance, their bodies swaying in rhythms that suggested hive-mind synchronization rather than individual thought. Their faces were hidden behind masks fashioned from flayed skin, and in their hands they carried weapons that ranged from rusted blades to autoguns that looked barely functional. Blade pressed himself into the shadows of a support column and waited. The cultists passed within meters of his position, their attention focused ahead rather than on their surroundings. He could hear them chanting under their breath, words in a language that made his teeth ache and his vampire nature recoil. They were searching for something, sweeping the area in patterns that suggested military training corrupted by warp madness. After they passed, Blade slipped from his hiding place and followed at a careful distance. The cultists led him deeper into the Rust Quarter, through sections where the architecture became increasingly alien. The buildings here were ancient, predating the current hive by centuries or perhaps millennia.
Their walls were covered in bas-reliefs depicting scenes of worship and sacrifice, and Blade realized with growing unease that this place had been a temple once, long before the Imperium had claimed this world. The cultists were not creating something new. They were restoring something old, awakening powers that had slumbered in the darkness since before humanity had reached for the stars. The patrol stopped at a massive set of doors, easily 20 meters tall and carved from a single dark stone. The doors were covered in more of the writhing sigils, and looking at them made Blade's vision blur and his head pound. The cultists approached the doors and began a new chant, their voices rising in harmonies that should not have been possible. The sigils pulsed in response, light bleeding from the stone itself, and the doors slowly ground open to reveal the chamber beyond. Blade caught a glimpse of what lay inside, and the sight made even his battle-hardened mind recoil in horror. The chamber was vast, easily the size of a cathedral, and it was filled with thousands of cultists engaged in a ritual of staggering complexity. They moved in concentric circles around the central altar, their bodies contorting in movements that defied human anatomy. Above them, suspended by chains that seemed to extend into infinity, hung more victims, their blood flowing down through channels carved into the floor to feed the altar below. And at the altar itself, conducting the ritual with the authority of a high priest, stood a figure that radiated power like a dark sun. It was tall, perhaps 9 feet in height, and its body was perfect in every proportion. Its skin was the color of fresh cream, unblemished and smooth as marble. Its features were beautiful beyond mortal beauty, androgynous and compelling in ways that Blade's instincts screamed warnings.
It wore armor that seemed woven from shadow and desire, plates that shifted and changed with every movement to reveal or conceal flesh according to no pattern he could discern. In one hand it held a staff topped with a human heart that still beat, and in the other it held a chalice that overflowed with blood that never spilled. This was no mere cultist. This was something older, more powerful, a being that had transcended human limitations and become something that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. Blade recognized it from the Inquisitor's briefings, from the warnings about entities that served the Chaos Gods directly. This was a daemon, a creature of the warp given form and purpose by the worship and sacrifice of mortal souls. The patrol cultists prostrated themselves before the doors, their chanting reaching a fevered pitch. The daemon at the altar turned its perfect gaze toward them, and even from this distance, Blade felt the weight of its attention like a physical force. When it spoke, its voice was every pleasure and pain combined into a single sensory experience that transcended simple sound. The harvest proceeds as ordained. The blood of 7 billion will water the seeds we have planted, and from their suffering will bloom gardens of eternal delight. The Prince is pleased with your devotion, my children. Soon, very soon, this entire world will know the ecstasy of transformation. The daemon raised the chalice to its lips and drank deeply. As it did, the victims hanging overhead began to scream in unison. Their blood flowed faster, the channels in the floor glowing with crimson light, and the ritual intensified to a crescendo that made the air itself vibrate with barely contained power. Blade felt it calling to him, felt the vampire within responding to the promise of blood and power and satisfaction. He forced it down, maintained control through sheer willpower, but knew he could not remain here much longer without risking exposure. He retreated carefully, backing away from the doors as they ground shut once more.
The patrol cultists remained prostrate, lost in their ecstatic devotion, and did not notice as he slipped back into the shadows. When he had put sufficient distance between himself and the temple, he activated his vox bead. "Inquisitor, this is Blade. I've located the cult's central operations. You need to hear this." Static crackled through the vox bead, interference from the warp energies saturating the area. Then the Inquisitor's voice came through, distorted but comprehensible. "Report." Blade described what he had seen, the temple and the ritual and the daemon coordinating it all. As he spoke, he could hear the tension building in the Inquisitor's responses, the calculations being made in real time about how to respond to this threat. When he finished, there was a long silence before she responded. "A daemon of Slaanesh manifested in the material realm and conducting mass sacrifices to strengthen its presence. This is worse than I feared. The cult is not simply draining victims for sustenance. They are preparing a ritual that will tear open the veil between realms and allow the warp to flood into Hive Sephiris. If they complete that ritual, the entire planet will be consumed by the immaterium within days." "How long do we have?" asked Blade. "Unknown. The ritual you observed was in its intermediate phases. Full manifestation requires precise astronomical alignments and sufficient sacrifice to weaken the barriers between worlds. My astropaths calculate we have perhaps 72 hours before conditions become optimal for summoning. After that, nothing short of exterminatus will save this world." Exterminatus, the final sanction of the Imperium, a judgment that condemned entire worlds to death rather than allow them to fall into the hands of chaos. Blade had heard the term during his briefings, understood what it meant in practical terms: cyclonic torpedoes and atmospheric incinerators that would reduce the planet's surface to lifeless ash. 7 billion people erased from existence because a cult had infected their hive. "There has to be another way," he said. "A surgical strike. Take out the daemon and the ritual collapses." "You are suggesting that we can kill a manifested daemon with conventional weapons. I admire your optimism, Hunter, but daemons do not die. They are banished back to the warp, and even that requires specialized equipment and extensive preparation. I do not have the resources for such an operation, not in the time available." Blade looked back toward the temple, at the faint glow visible through cracks in the ancient stone. He thought about the thousands of cultists inside, about the victims hanging from chains, about the 7 billion souls living above them who had no idea their world was about to end. He thought about every vampire he had ever killed, every monster he had hunted through the darkness, and realized that this was no different. Different scale, different stakes, but the same fundamental truth. Someone had to stand between the monsters and the innocent, even when the odds were impossible. "I'm going in," he said. "I'll kill the daemon or die trying. Either way, you'll have your answer. Negative, you will maintain your current position and provide reconnaissance until the guard regiment arrives. That is a direct order." "Then court-martial me after I'm dead." Blade pulled the vox bead from his ear and crushed it beneath his boot. The Inquisitor's voice cut off mid-protest, leaving him alone in the darkness of the underhive. He knew he had just made an enemy of the one person in this nightmare galaxy who might have helped him find home, but he also knew he could not stand by while millions died. It was not in his nature. It was not who he was. He checked his weapons, the bolt pistol and combat knife that would be laughably inadequate against what waited inside the temple. He thought about his strengths and his limitations, about what he could do with enhanced speed and strength against enemies that commanded the powers of hell itself.
and he realized that he had one advantage the cultists would not expect. He was a vampire, a creature that fed on blood and life force, and the temple was saturated with blood magic, channels and rivers of stolen vitality flowing through carved stone to power the ritual. If he could disrupt that flow, sever the connection between the victims and the altar, he might be able to weaken the daemon enough to banish it.
It was a desperate plan, built on assumptions and hope rather than solid intelligence, but it was the only plan he had. Blade moved back toward the temple doors, timing his approach to coincide with the next patrol rotation. When the cultists came through, lost in their devotional trance, he struck from the shadows. The first went down with his throat crushed, dying silently. The second he dispatched with the combat knife, the blessed blade punching through ribs to pierce the heart. The others died in similar fashion, their bodies left cooling in the darkness as Blade stripped one of their robes and pulled it over his gear. Disguised as a cultist, he passed through the doors and into the temple proper. The scale of the ritual was even more overwhelming from within. Thousands of voices rose in unison, creating harmonies that bypassed the ear and resonated directly in the skull. The air was thick with incense and blood scent, a narcotic combination that would have overwhelmed normal senses. Blade moved through the crowd, adopting the swaying gait of the cultists around him, his face hidden beneath the flayed skin mask. He could feel the warp energies washing over him, trying to find purchase in his mind. But his vampire nature created a buffer of sorts. The infection that sustained him was too alien, too fundamentally predatory to allow the seductive whispers of Slaanesh to take root. He worked his way toward the outer rings of the ritual, where the channels carved into the floor glowed brightest with flowing blood. The channels formed complex patterns, geometric designs that hurt to look upon directly, all converging on the central altar where the demon conducted its obscene liturgy. Blade knelt beside one of the channels and pressed his hand into the flow, feeling the stolen life force burning against his skin. The blood was not merely physical substance, it was charged with psychic energy, the terror and pain of the victims amplified and refined into raw power for the demon to consume. He pulled the bolt pistol from beneath his stolen robes and aimed it at the channel's junction point, where multiple flows converged before continuing toward the altar. The mass-reactive round struck with devastating force, shattering the carved stone and spraying blood across the nearby cultists. The disruption was immediate. The ritual's rhythm faltered as power was diverted, rerouted through damaged channels that could not handle the increased flow. Cultists near the damaged section began to scream as the backwash of warp energy burned through their inadequate bodies, immolating them from within. The demon's perfect head snapped around, its gaze locking onto Blade with terrible precision. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Then the demon smiled, and the expression was worse than any snarl of rage could have been. "A hunter in our midst, how exquisite! You have disrupted our sacred work, little vampire, and for that you will be given the honor of joining our prince's eternal dance." The demon gestured, and the cultists surrounding Blade transformed. Their robes fell away as their bodies underwent rapid and horrifying mutations. Limbs elongated into bladed appendages, flesh split to reveal sensory organs that should not exist, mouths opened where no mouths should be, filled with teeth like broken glass. They fell upon him with inhuman hunger, their transformed bodies moving with speed that rivaled his own. Blade fought with everything he had. The bolt pistol barked, each round finding a target and detonating inside corrupted flesh. The combat knife flashed, opening throats and severing tendons with surgical precision. His enhanced strength allowed him to tear limbs from sockets and crush skulls with his bare hands. But there were too many, and they kept coming, drawn by the demon's will and sustained by warp energies that cared nothing for physical damage. For every one he killed, two more took its place, emerging from the crowd of worshippers eager to prove their devotion.
He was being overwhelmed, driven back toward the central altar, his gear stripped away, and his body accumulating injuries faster than his healing could compensate. A bladed appendage caught him across the ribs, opening wounds that wept blood onto the temple floor. A cultist with acidic saliva spat in his face, the burning substance eating into his skin. Another wrapped tentacles around his throat, choking off his air supply, and he had to tear it away with hands that left his own skin behind in the process. Through the chaos of combat, Blade saw the demon watching with evident pleasure, feeding on the violence and suffering like a connoisseur savoring a fine meal. It made no move to join the fight, content to observe as its servants attempted to drag the interloper down. But there was something in its posture, tension that suggested concern beneath the facade of amusement. The disruption to the ritual had cost it power, forced it to divert resources to repair the damage, and every moment Blade survived was another moment the demon could not focus on completing its summoning. He changed tactics. Instead of trying to fight his way out, he fought his way in, toward the altar and the demon itself. The cultists tried to intercept him, but he was faster, his vampire speed allowing him to slip through gaps in their press. He vaulted over outstretched limbs, ducked under slashing blades, and drove forward with single-minded determination. If he could reach the demon, if he could damage the altar itself, he might disrupt the ritual beyond any possibility of repair. The demon's amusement faded as it realized his intent. It raised the staff with the beating heart, and reality screamed in protest. Warp energies lashed out, invisible arcs of purple lightning striking Blade and sending him crashing to the floor. His muscles spasmed uncontrollably, his nervous system overloaded by power that should not exist in the material realm. The demon advanced slowly, savoring his helplessness. "You are brave, little hunter, foolish but brave. You thought to deny our ascension, to rob the prince of the offering we have prepared with such care. But you are just one creature, alone and outmatched in a temple consecrated by the blood of millions. What could you possibly hope to achieve?" Blade tried to speak, tried to force words through a throat that would not obey his commands. The demon leaned closer, its perfect face filling his vision, and he could see his reflection in its eyes. He saw himself as the demon saw him, a broken thing, lying in a pool of his own blood, a failed hunter at the end of a futile quest. And in that moment of absolute despair, he felt something shift inside himself. The vampire within him, the infection that had been his curse and his gift for so long, surged forward with renewed hunger. It had tasted the blood flowing through the temple's channels. It had felt the psychic energy saturating the air, and it wanted more. It wanted everything. The boundaries that Blade maintained through discipline and medication dissolved, and for the first time in decades, he allowed the monster full control.
His body convulsed as the transformation overtook him. His eyes darkened until they were black pools reflecting no light. His teeth elongated into fangs that could tear through ceramite. His muscles swelled with power drawn from reserves he had never accessed, from the very essence of vampirism itself. He rose from the floor with a roar that was part human scream and part predatory howl, and the demon actually took a step backward. "What are you?" it whispered, and for the first time, Blade heard genuine uncertainty in its voice. He did not answer with words. He lunged forward and sank his fangs into the demon's perfect throat, drinking deeply of the essence that sustained its manifestation. The demon shrieked, a sound that shattered lumen strips and cracked stone, as Blade's vampire nature tore into its warp stuff and consumed it. The demon's form began to destabilize, its perfection fracturing into fragments that revealed the seething chaos beneath. It struggled, beating at Blade with fists that struck like thunder, but he held on with desperate strength, drinking and drinking until the demon's struggles grew weaker. Around them, the ritual was collapsing. The cultists who had been sustained by the demon's power began to fall, their transformed bodies reverting to human forms that could not survive the transition.
The channels carved into the floor went dark as the stolen life force dissipated back into the warp. The victims hanging from chains began to stir, consciousness returning as the demon's hold over them weakened, and the temple itself groaned, its ancient structure protesting the violent disruption of energies that had been building for months. The demon's form finally collapsed, dissolving into mist and shadow that dissipated into the void. Blade fell to his knees, his body reverting to its normal state, his mind reeling from what he had just done. He had not merely banished the demon, he had consumed part of its essence, incorporated warp energy directly into his vampire nature. He could feel it burning inside him, alien power that his infection was struggling to process and integrate. He did not know if that made him stronger or if he had just damned himself in ways the Inquisitor could not have imagined. The temple was silent now, the cultists dead or fled, the ritual broken beyond repair. Blade staggered to his feet and looked around at the devastation. Thousands of bodies lay cooling on the floor, and the stench of death was overwhelming even to his enhanced senses. Above him, the victims were slowly being lowered by servitors that had apparently survived the chaos, their automated programming compelling them to render aid now that the immediate threat had passed. He should have felt victorious. He had stopped the summoning, saved the planet from damnation, proven that even demons could be defeated with the right combination of desperation and audacity. But instead, he felt hollow, exhausted in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. He had let the monster take control. He had fed on warp stuff, on the essence of demons themselves, and he did not know what that meant for his future or his soul. The vox bead he had crushed earlier crackled to life, somehow still functional despite the damage. The Inquisitor's voice came through, tight with barely controlled fury. "Blade, answer immediately, or I will have this entire section of the Underhive reduced to molten slag." He retrieved the broken device and held it to his ear. "I'm here. The demon is banished. The ritual is broken. Send your people in to secure the survivors." There was a long silence. "Then you disobeyed a direct order. You broke Vox discipline in the middle of an active operation. You engaged an enemy far beyond your capability to defeat, and somehow survived. I should have you executed for insubordination." Another pause. "But you also saved 7 billion lives and eliminated a major chaos threat. That earns you a temporary reprieve. Remain at your current position. Extraction teams are en route." The Vox went dead, and Blade was left alone in the temple with the bodies of the cultists and the slowly waking survivors. He sat down on the altar steps, too tired to care about the symbolism, and closed his eyes. He had won this round, but he knew there would be others. This galaxy was full of monsters, and he was trapped here with them, a hunter without a home, a weapon without a master. But he was still alive, and as long as he was alive, he would keep hunting. The extraction team arrived 30 minutes later, a full company of Imperial Guard backed by Death Watch Marines and battle servitors. They swept through the temple with military efficiency, cataloging corpses and securing survivors, and purging every surface with blessed promethium to ensure no taint remained. Blade watched from his position on the altar steps, not moving until an inquisitorial interrogator approached with a dozen armed guards and politely but firmly escorted him to a transport that would take him back to the surface. The journey through the hive was surreal. They passed through levels where life continued as normal, where billions of people went about their daily struggles, unaware that they had been hours away from annihilation. The transport climbed through industrial zones and residential districts, past the spires where the wealthy lived in luxury built on the suffering of those below. And finally they emerged onto the surface, into an air that was polluted but breathable, under a sky that was gray with industrial waste but still recognizably a sky. The sword of righteous censure hung in orbit above, a dark spear against the planet's clouds. The transport docked with a shuttle that ferried Blade back to the inquisitorial vessel, and he found himself once again in the Medicae bay, once again strapped to the examination slab, while tech priests and servitors poked and prodded at his body. But this time, the Inquisitor was present, watching the proceedings with an expression that was difficult to read. When the examination concluded, she dismissed the tech priests and approached Blade directly. For a long moment, she simply studied him, as if trying to solve a puzzle that defied conventional analysis. Then she spoke. "The tech priests report that you are contaminated with warp energy. Specifically, you have incorporated demonic essence into your cellular structure through an act of vampiric consumption. By all rights, I should declare you corrupted and order your immediate termination." She paused. "But the corruption appears stable. Your viral infection is breaking down the warp energy and converting it into something your physiology can process. It is unprecedented and frankly disturbing, but it does not appear to pose an immediate threat to those around you."
Blade said nothing. He had known the risks when he allowed himself to feed on the demon's essence. He had made his choice and would live with the consequences. The Inquisitor continued. "You saved billions of lives today. You also disobeyed orders and demonstrated a disturbing tendency toward reckless heroics. I am uncertain whether you are an asset or a liability." She reached a decision. "I am placing you under inquisitorial custody indefinitely. You will accompany my kill team as we continue our investigation into the cult's remaining operations. You will follow orders without question, and you will submit to regular examination to ensure the warp contamination does not spread. In exchange, I will provide you with the resources and support necessary to continue your hunt. Do you accept these terms?" It was not really a question. Blade understood that refusing would result in his execution, that the Inquisitor was offering him the only path forward that did not end in a bolt shell through his skull. But it was also an opportunity. If he remained with the Inquisition, he would have access to information and resources that might eventually lead him to a way home. He would also have a purpose, a mission that aligned with what he had been doing for decades before his arrival in this nightmare galaxy. "I accept," he said. The Inquisitor nodded, satisfied. "Good, then we have work to do. The demon you banished was only one piece of a larger operation. Our intelligence suggests there are other cells, other temples scattered throughout the sector. We will find them, we will destroy them, and you will be our weapon against the darkness." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. You asked me earlier what you were, whether you were an angel sent by the Emperor. I have thought about that question, and I have an answer. You are not an angel. You are a hunter, the same as you have always been, and in this galaxy, that makes you rare and valuable beyond measure. Do not waste that gift by dying foolishly." She left, and Blade was alone again with his thoughts. He looked down at his hands, at the skin that had touched demonic essence and survived. He thought about the monster he had released inside himself, about the vampire he had finally allowed to feed without restraint, and he wondered if he was still the man he had been in that temple, or if he had become something new shaped by this galaxy's horrors into a weapon that could fight on its own terms. He did not have an answer, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would keep hunting, he would keep fighting, and he would find a way to survive in this nightmare universe no matter the cost, because that was what hunters did. They adapted, they endured, and they never stopped moving forward, even when the darkness seemed infinite and the prey impossible to kill. In the days that followed, Blade accompanied the Inquisitor's kill team to 3 more cult strongholds across the sector. Each operation followed a similar pattern: intelligence gathering, infiltration, violent confrontation with corrupted humans and daemon-touched creatures, extraction with survivors when possible, purging with holy fire when not. And throughout it all, Blade fought with the brutal efficiency that had defined his existence, killing monsters and saving the innocent in equal measure. He learned the rhythms of imperial warfare, the doctrines and strategies that governed how humanity fought its endless war against the darkness. He learned to recognize the signs of chaos corruption, the subtle tells that marked someone as a cultist or a daemon-touched host. He learned to move through battlefields where the laws of reality were suggestions rather than rules, where physics bent to the will of entities that existed beyond mortal comprehension. And he learned that he was not alone in his war. The galaxy was full of hunters like himself, men and women who had dedicated their lives to fighting the monsters that preyed on humanity.
Some wore the armor of space marines, genetically engineered warriors who knew nothing but war. Others served the Inquisition, agents of imperial authority that wielded authority and firepower in equal measure. Still others were simple soldiers, mortals with lasguns and faith, who stood against horrors that should have broken them. They were all doing what Blade had always done, standing between the monsters and the innocent, fighting even when the odds were impossible, refusing to surrender even when death would have been easier. In that, at least, he had found something familiar in this alien universe. The fourth operation took them to a world called Mortre, a death world where the population lived in sealed habs surrounded by hostile wilderness. The cult had infiltrated one of the domes, a research station that studied the planet's aggressive ecosystem, and had been using the researchers as experimental subjects for a new strain of the vampiric infection. When Blade and the kill team arrived, they found a station full of creatures that were neither fully human nor fully daemon, trapped in a perpetual transformation that left them mad with pain and hunger. The purge was brutal and complete. Blade moved through the station's corridors with methodical precision, his combat knife and bolt pistol dispatching the infected with clinical efficiency. But as he fought, he could not help but see himself in the creature's eyes, could not help but recognize the same struggle he faced every day. They had been human once. They had been infected with something that changed them, twisted them into monsters they had not chosen to become. The only difference was that he had maintained his humanity through discipline and will, while they had been overwhelmed by the transformation. It was a sobering reminder of how thin the line was between hunter and monster, between salvation and damnation. When the operation concluded, the Inquisitor approached him in the station's command center. Outside, servitors were already beginning the process of sterilizing the facility, burning away every trace of corruption. She carried a data slate, and her expression was troubled. "We have intercepted astropathic communications suggesting the cult has established a major stronghold on a world called Numeron Quintus, deep in the sector's frontier regions. Our intelligence is limited, but reports suggest they have been operating there for years, building power and converting the local population. If we are to truly end this threat, we must strike at Numeron Quintus and destroy whatever they have built there."
Blade cleaned his knife on a piece of cloth, wiping away the blood and worse substances that coated the blade. "How long until we can move on this target?" 2 weeks. We need to requisition additional forces and coordinate with the local Imperial Navy assets. This will not be a simple infiltration operation. This will be a war. She paused. "I am giving you the option to withdraw. You have served well, exceeded all expectations, and I can arrange transport to a civilized world where you can attempt to build a new life. You have earned that much." Blade looked at her, at the woman who had threatened him with execution and then given him purpose in this nightmare galaxy. He thought about what withdrawal would mean, about trying to live a normal life in a universe that was fundamentally hostile to his existence. He thought about the monsters that would continue to hunt the innocent if he walked away, about the cultists and daemons that would feed on suffering in his absence. He thought about who he was and who he had always been. "I'm not built for retirement, Inquisitor. I'm built for war. I'll see this through to the end." The Inquisitor allowed herself a rare smile. "I expected nothing less. Then prepare yourself, Hunter. Numeron Quintus will test everything you have learned, everything you have become. And if we fail there, the cult will spread beyond our ability to contain it." She left, and Blade was once again alone with his thoughts. He looked out through the station's reinforced windows at the hostile wilderness beyond and the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the storms and the void, a war was waiting, a final confrontation with the forces that had nearly consumed this galaxy's inhabitants. He had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Every vampire he had killed, every fight he had survived, every lesson he had learned in the blood and darkness had been leading toward this. He was no longer just a hunter from another world, lost and alone in an alien universe. He was a weapon forged in the fires of two realities, shaped by experiences that transcended conventional understanding. He was Blade, Daywalker, Vampire Hunter, and he was ready.